I want you to think for a moment, whether past or present, some of the frustrations that you've experienced, some of the obstacles, the heartaches, the disappointments, whether it was a short period or a season in your life. I just want you to think for a moment about one or some of those types of situations that you found yourselves in. Because when we think about those things, they can really consume us, and we can think of how difficult that was or difficult that is now. But I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as I share this morning. But one thing I don't want you to do is I don't want you to reason it away. Most things we can reason away saying, well, somebody else has it worse than we do. And while that may be true, somebody else may have worse financial situation than you do, a worse marriage than you do, a worse whatever. But I'm getting to a point here, and I don't want you to reason it away. I don't want to negate what we went through or what you're going through now. So I want you to think about that. Because following Jesus is a long-term investment. Eugene Peterson wrote the book, Long Obedience in the Same Direction, Discipleship in an Instant Society. And in the book kind of just goes through the process of how we can follow Jesus our entire lives and what that takes. Just because we've started following Jesus 5, 10, 20, 40, 50 years ago doesn't mean our discipleship process has stopped. But one of the traps that we fall into is we can be faithful to Jesus, and when things don't work out, we say, what's wrong? If I'm not as successful as I would like to be, we say, why isn't Jesus fulfilling his part? What am I doing wrong? How am I failing? That's not exactly how it works. That's not what Peterson was getting to when he talked about his book. Now I would say that long obedience in the same direction provides opportunities. But one of the things we have to recognize with opportunities for God is this is not an opportunity to have a bigger portfolio. It's not an opportunity just to have a better position at work or be more prominent in the community. There's something deeper that God is getting at when he gives us opportunities. It's just not the here and now. There's something greater. And we find with Joseph in the Old Testament that his life had a lot of difficulties. Now, some of them may have been a little self-inflicted, but in general, Joseph was a pretty innocent victim. So I'm going to recap some of his life so we're all on the same page. Joseph was the 11th son. He had 10 older brothers, and Joseph was above and beyond the favorites, and everybody knew it, so his brothers hated him and were jealous. And I get the impression that Joseph kind of flaunted that around a little bit because he told his brothers these dreams in which he was going to rule over them. Made them even more mad, to the point where they plotted to kill him. Well, then they took a step back, and instead of killed him, they sold him into slavery and faked his death. So Joseph was sold into slavery. He was taken from his homeland and was taken to Egypt, a foreign country, and became a slave. But God was with him. That's one of the powerful things of Joseph's story is we find time and time again that God was with him. And he thrived in his position as a slave until a false accusation came and got Joseph thrown in jail. He didn't do anything wrong. In fact, he lived with integrity, but yet the false accusation was his downfall, and he was put in jail. And in the ancient world, jail was a place where you just went to die. You didn't wait to get a fair trial. You didn't have a certain length of prison sentence. You just waited to either be executed or die of old age or disease of something of that nature. So Joseph just sat in prison. But again, the Bible tells us, but God was with Joseph, and he thrived. In fact, the jailer didn't even concern himself with anything about Joseph. He just trusted him and let him do his thing. While Joseph was in prison, the cupbearer and the baker for Pharaoh, king of Egypt, came down to prison, were thrown into prison for a time being. And both of these guys had a dream, and they were disturbed. And so they shared the dream with Joseph. And so Joseph told the cupbearer, hey, you're going to be restored to Pharaoh. And he said, when you do, don't forget me. Now the baker, feeling really confident on that interpretation, asked Joseph to interpret his dream. And Joseph said, well, you're not going to have a very good end. You're going to be essentially executed. And that's what happened is both the cupbearer and the baker's dreams were correctly interpreted by Joseph. And the cupbearer was restored and the baker wasn't. But then, an entire 2 years of Joseph's life is summed up in about half a sentence. And it says, 2 full years pass. The cupbearer had forgotten Joseph, and so he stayed in prison for 2 more full years. Then one day, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had 2 dreams, and no one could interpret these dreams. All of a sudden, the cupbearer remembered this guy he met in prison, who correctly interpreted his dream and the dream of the baker. And so he goes to Pharaoh and he says, hey, I know this guy that might be worth seeking. See, Pharaoh had all of the resources at his disposal. He was the most powerful person in the most powerful country in all the world. So if there was a resource that he needed, he could get it. But all these advisors, all these wise people that he consulted could not interpret his dream. So he was desperate. Now the cupbearer likely had a close relationship with Pharaoh. Cupbearer's responsibility was to make sure Pharaoh didn't get poisoned, which means the cupbearer would get poisoned before Pharaoh would. He would taste his drinks and food and make sure that everything that was presented to Pharaoh was good. So they were likely in close contact on a regular basis. So when the cupbearer said something, Pharaoh probably accepted it. And so even though he had all these resources at his disposal, the most powerful person in the entire world sought the counsel and advice of a prisoner. And all of a sudden, a flurry of activity likely happens. Joseph had been in prison for years. It had been 2 years since he interacted with the cupbearer. And in prison in the ancient world, the prison system didn't really care much about your personal hygiene. And so he had to get ready, get prepared in order to encounter Pharaoh. He had to shave, had to wash, had to get new clothes on, might have had to get some dental work done, get some food in his system, had all these things that had to happen. So Joseph is probably sitting there thinking, I don't know what's happening. Like, this is crazy. Things are moving at a pace where he's not used to, where he hasn't had any experience like this in his entire life. So he was made to look the part. And he goes to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells him this dream. And essentially in the dreams, Joseph says it means that there's going to be 7 years of plenty in the land, followed by 7 years of famine. And there's 2 dreams. Joseph says there's 2 dreams because God has firmly decided that this is going to happen. But then Joseph does something that's just great. This prisoner is before the most powerful person in all the world. This prisoner starts giving Pharaoh advice. Well, here's what I would do if I was you. Now think of how crazy that is. Someone who's been in prison for several years, is scum, is nobody, has no social standing, has no possessions to his name except the clothes that he's wearing, which aren't really even his. He is giving advice to the most powerful person in all the world, who has all the resources at his disposal. But one of the things we find about Joseph is he is a broken individual. For these years, he has been enslaved and imprisoned. And God has been working and shaping in his life. He was not hardened. He was not bitter, but he had been broken and then restored by God. And so for him to give advice, there was no ulterior motive. There was no agenda that he was trying to pursue. It was a broken person who had been healed by God sharing his wisdom. That is who Joseph was in this moment. So even though it was a little weird or strange for him to give advice, it was God's grace that had worked in and through him through these years so that he could do it. But Joseph also recognized that in order to prevent catastrophe, they needed to act quickly. If there's going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, they needed to make sure that they were prepared before the 7 years of famine happened. If they would wait or tarry or take their time, those were lives that were at stake. So Pharaoh heard what Joseph had said, heard his advice, heard his interpretation. And in Genesis chapter 41, starting in verse 41, he says to Joseph, what is seemingly out of the blue, I put you in charge of all Egypt. And Pharaoh took his signet ring and put it on Joseph. He dressed Joseph in fine clothes and put a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in his chariot reserved for his second in command. And everywhere Joseph went, the command was shouted, "Kneel down." So Joseph took command of the entire land of Egypt, and Pharaoh said to him, "I am Pharaoh, but without you no one will lift a hand or foot in all the kingdom. It requires your approval." Then Pharaoh went to Joseph and said, "I am giving you a new name, an Egyptian name, which is Zephanath-Paneah." He also gave him a wife whose name was Asenath. And Joseph took command of all Egypt. Talk about a change. Talk about a flip. The complete opposite. He went from being a nobody. Nobody didn't even care about this guy, Joseph. That's how low he was. And then he became second in command in all Egypt. Outside of Pharaoh, he had complete authority to do whatever he felt was necessary. But the thing about Joseph is that his entire life had prepared him for this moment. He was ready. Not because he had read some leadership book, not because he was smarter than somebody else or had a higher IQ, but because God had been working and shaping his life to get him to this position so he could serve in such capacity. God chose Joseph. Even though he was enslaved and imprisoned, God was working in his life. God never forgot about Joseph wherever he was. Then the perks that Joseph received, he got the signet ring, which was a ring that had some type of indent and engraving that was a stamp that you put into wax to say this is what Pharaoh says. It was essentially Pharaoh's signature. He could make any decree or any charge or command, use a signet ring, and it would happen. Joseph had that authority. But then he got some nice clothes, got some nice jewelry. Then he got what would be a fancy limo of the day, this chariot that was reserved for the second in command. So he had all these perks. And there are times when we get these perks, we start feeling pretty entitled. You know, your company gives you these expense accounts or per diem when you go on a work trip, and you're like, well, I can spend all this money. I can do all these things and live more lavishly than I otherwise would. So Joseph had all those temptations, all those traps. But again, he was prepared for this moment. He had been humbled and broken and restored by God. But God was faithful. God never left Joseph. And Joseph was faithful to God as well. And his story, Joseph's story, shows us that long obedience in the same direction provides opportunities. Not as though you're going to have such an extreme switch from a worldly perspective as Joseph, but that God will provide opportunities for you to enter his story. Now, the thing about Joseph, and anybody that we find in the Bible, and hopefully anybody throughout history, is that this story is not about Joseph. It's about God and how God included Joseph in his story. See, whenever we think Joseph is the main character of the story, we start to put God on the back burner. And then we start doing that in our life. If I am the main character in my story, then God is not. And we start running into trouble when we do that. So this is about God's story. And so the suffering that Joseph encountered, the years as a slave and prisoner, are part of God's story, that God invited Joseph into his story of redemption, of salvation. So we ask ourselves, what qualified Joseph to lead? Well, God did. Now, maybe that's a cop-out answer, but God shaped him through the years of imprisonment and enslavement. Joseph didn't earn his position. In fact, when he interpreted the dream for Pharaoh and for the cupbearer and the baker, he said, I can't do it, but God can. God can give us the wisdom to understand the message that he is giving us. So Joseph, even when he was in prison, and even when he stood before Pharaoh with nothing to lose, gave credit to God before he did anything else. That is how he lived his life. He didn't compromise. And we actually find that Joseph did not assimilate to the Egyptian culture. When we start to compromise, to make little compromises, they snowball real quickly. Little compromises become compromises that are a little bigger and a little bigger and a little bigger. And before we know, we've compromised way more than we ever intended to in the first place. But Joseph didn't. And I love the name that Pharaoh gave him, the Egyptian name. It means God speaks and lives, which I think is fitting for Joseph. It's fitting for his story, fitting for how God worked in and through him. He'd been enslaved and imprisoned, but God was with him. God helped him thrive and succeed. And so Joseph is finally getting the fruit of his suffering and of his labor that God had prepared him for this moment. God lives in and through Joseph. God speaks in and through Joseph. And his life is given all these opportunities because he continued to be faithful to God even when he didn't see what God was doing. But I do find this interesting. It says he was 30 years old when he became second in command. And when he left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land. As predicted, for 7 years, the land produced a bumper crop. During those years, Joseph gathered all the crops throughout Egypt and stored the grain. He piled up huge amounts of grain, so much that he could no longer measure it. During the time of plenty, 2 sons were born to Joseph. He named the first Manasseh, which means God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. Then he named his second son Ephraim, which means God has made me fruitful in this land of my grief. So he was 30 when this happened. Now he was 17 when he was sold into slavery and taken down to Egypt. So for 13 years, he was a slave and in prison. When if you do the math, that's 43% of his life up to that point had been outside of his control. Remember, he grew up privileged. He grew up the favored son. He got special clothes. He got special treatment. Everything about his life was just cushy until he got sold into slavery. And for 43% of his life was just despair. Now, Joseph lived to be 110. So if we do the math on 13 years, that's 11% of his life was in that period. And that's a much different perspective. But I think what happens too many times is we live in that 43% and allow that to define who we are. But Joseph was never embittered by that. He was never consumed by it because he had been redeemed by God. He had been humbled, broken, and restored in God. So God was able to use him throughout the rest of his life. God prepared him during those difficult times. So when he became second in command in Egypt, he collected the abundance. He was able to store and receive the grain that the people grew. Now, if you think of this, especially when you get to the point where they collected so much they could no longer measure it, Joseph could very easily have manipulated the system for personal gain. He could have been a corrupt political leader without much of a problem, especially for the fact that his predictions came true. He probably had a long leash, a lot of leeway, but yet he lived with integrity. He was broken, so he was prepared for this. And I'm stressing the fact that he'd been prepared for this because a lot of times we long for these high and lofty positions before we're ready for them. Joseph probably didn't want to be in prison. He probably didn't want to be enslaved. He longed for other things, to be more successful, to thrive, to be in a better position. But only when he was ready was God moving him. So these 13 years proved essential and formative for Joseph as he led and God used him. Now, what's interesting, if you think of the dreams, they had 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. God didn't provide the details and the logistics of what was going to happen. So in this story, we do find that there's human responsibility that God extends to us. Just because Joseph knew the dream, interpreted the dream, understand what God was meaning through the dream, didn't mean that it stopped. There's responsibility at hand. So we are all responsible for the lives that God has given us, which is why we come back to the long obedience in the same direction provides opportunities. God is providing opportunities for you in your life. I don't know where that is. I don't know where you are, but I know that He is. He's providing them for you so that you can impact the world for Him. But as I mentioned, Joseph did not assimilate to the Egyptian culture. And one of the ways we find that is through the names of his sons. Joseph had been given an Egyptian name. Zaphenath-Paneah was his Egyptian name. He did not give his sons Egyptian names. He gave them Hebrew names, names of his family, of his origin, of the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is where he came from. He gave Manasseh, which means to forget, and Ephraim, which means twice fruitful. His life was way different now. He had position. He had a new life. He had a family. He had anything and everything he could have wanted, but he still remained true to God. He didn't fall into the traps of the positional power that he was given, the perks that he had been afforded. He could now seek revenge on anybody he wanted to. But he stayed true to God. He stayed faithful to Him. So one of the challenges I have for you today is to keep your eyes fixed upon Jesus. Because a lot of times our troubles, our difficulties, our unfortunate circumstances, the things we wish were different can get us distracted. So I'm not going to say that keeping your eyes fixed upon Jesus is going to solve all your temporary problems, but I promise you it will solve all your eternal ones. It will make your future secure. And when I say future, I don't necessarily mean what you're going to eat for lunch tomorrow, or how you're going to pay the bills, or how you're going to raise your kids, or how you're going to interact with a coworker that bothers you. But I'm talking about the eternity that we have in the name of Jesus. Because those frustrations we have, the disappointments, the heartaches, they can be redeemed in the name of Jesus through the power of God. They can be used for Him. Because we can look back on them and we can become embittered. We can become disheartened. We become so frustrated that we say, I don't know why this is happening or why God would allow it to happen. Think of Joseph. He was sold into slavery because he was arrogant to his brothers. And then he was imprisoned for living with integrity. He had a lot of times where he'd say, God, why'd you allow this to happen? But remember, it's God's story that God invites us to participate in. But at the beginning, I asked you not to reason your troubles, your disappointments away by saying somebody else has it worse, because that negates our suffering. God's heart is broken when we are broken. He hurts when we hurt. And what that says to me is that He doesn't want our hurt to be in vain. He doesn't want our struggles to just be struggles with no point. He wants them to be redeemed so that the world can come to know Him, so that we can grow closer to Him, so that others can grow closer to Him, and so that people can see who He is and His goodness in our life. Long obedience in the same direction brings opportunities. I don't know what opportunities you have in your life, but I promise you that you have them. And God wants to use you and your past experiences to build His kingdom and impact the world and yourself for Him.